Good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Now we're together. How many of you have been in one or more of the previous sessions? Okay. So I still need to go over a few. How many of you have not? Let's put it up that way then. Okay, fine. Got it. So we're going to be talking today, and last hour we were doing data and problem solving in an hour and 15 minutes. And by the end of it, it's a good thing I didn't have a little pulse oximeter on my finger. I'm sure my heart rate was going unacceptably high. So this is going to be a little slower paced because we don't have to get through so much stuff. And it's taking a look at effective teaming and collaboration. Now, I'm not talking about effective generically. I'm talking about what kind of teaming and collaboration is evidence-based to improve student outcomes. That's the issue, and there's not many types. I will give you a heads up about that. So a couple of things to ask you first. Is it warmer in here? Yeah, I have on hot flashes or something. Because I was cold in the other room, and I thought, we didn't walk that far. It feels like we're in somebody's attic. I feel like I could jump up and touch this. So, and we're not. We're in somebody's basement, actually. I think we came down the stairs. Okay. So when we look at teaming and collaboration, everybody will say they do it. There's a couple of things that are going to be important as we look at this. How many of you have a significant amount of time during the school day built into your schedules, at least weekly, to collaborate and have team meetings? Okay, a few. That has to be taken care of first. You can't collaborate by talking fast. And unless we can collaborate, then have time to do it, then it's kind of like last hour I said, why are we working on problem solving a reading difficulty for a student who's absent 40% of the time? We should work on the absences first, right? Well, that's good. Gee, you are a very easy group. So the same here. Collaboration is deliberate, and the areas we're going to talk about cannot be done quickly. The collaboration is not passing in the hall, saying something. I will also show you some data that only in schools where there's a school level of collaboration does collaboration relate to student outcomes. Individual collaborations typically do not. So this is a systems level issue, not just whatever we're doing now. Oh, do I have to stay here? Do I have to stay here? I thought I was going to get to walk around. Oh, this side. Okay, I'll stay on this side. Okay, because of yeah, okay, all right. We're trying to figure that out. So part of the reason I have to walk around is either that or I have to put on my glasses. So some of the goals for today. We're going to discuss the evidence base for teaming and collaboration. We're going to share the research that I've already talked about. We're going to share perspectives on the degree to which your district is doing any of this stuff. And the last goal for every one of the sessions that I do is ask you to say, okay, if we're going to make the shift and do teaming and collaboration this way, what are we doing already that we can build on, facilitators? And what are the barriers going to be? And with all systems work, unless you reduce or eliminate the barriers, you're not going to be able to implement it. So think about that that last issue, as we go through some things today. Think, wow, we're already doing something like that. We have this, we have that, we have the other. But what are the barriers to doing it this way? And you might even choose to put facilitators and barriers. So this is primarily for those of you who haven't been to the other sessions. This one, I don't know why this is all you're doing. These are the 6 components of MTSS. They are the 6 components because they are things that are evidence-based, when present, improve student outcomes. We don't have any components in the MTSS model that is not related to improving student outcomes. That's why it's a framework. You can't just pick. I work with a state, and I won't say who, it doesn't matter, where they collapsed some of these because they wanted to only have 4. You can't have 4 because each of these contributes a certain amount to the variance that predicts student outcomes. And if you start collapsing them, you're not going to get that oomph in doing it. So if these arrows went where they're supposed to, each one of these hexagons has an arrow going to multiple tiers of instruction. And I'll explain that here in a second. Now they're going. This chart, and for those of you who've been to the other sessions, just bear with me. This chart on the left-hand side has the components of MTSS. And on the right-hand side is the evidence for the impact that component has on student outcomes. Does that make sense? So let's take a look at the first one, leadership. And if you're interested, the first session I did was on the Wallace report. If you want to get the Wallace report, it's free, you can just download it. It's called the Wallace Report from the Wallace Foundation, 2021. So just go Wallace Report 2021 and it'll pop up and download it. It's really cool reading. I know that kind of stuff may not excite you, but it gets me all excited. 33% for instruction. 33% of what predicts student outcomes can be aligned with effective instruction in the classroom. That's about it. So if we're not going to do the rest of this stuff with MTSS, we're saying to the teachers, you are responsible for moving these kids along instructionally by yourself. You're on your own. And there's a limit to what that can do, right? We have basically 350 minutes a day, 335 to 350 minutes a day of teaching. We have, in the elementary level, 90 minutes a day assigned to ELA. We discussed last hour that 90 minutes is what predicts the benchmarks. Academic engaged time, the time that student is engaged with quality instruction, is the best predictor of student growth. So if we had reading at 60 minutes a day in our schools, those benchmarks would be brought down because amount of academic engaged time. If we accelerated them, then we could move the benchmarks further. That is why in MTSS, whether it's academic or behavior, the tiers are differentiated by time. Tier 2 is up to 50% more than what they're getting in Tier 1, and Tier 3 is up to another 50% on top of that. I had somebody asking me a question about time. Where I come from, all of our schedules are built in at the elementary level to have 180 minutes a day available for reading instruction. A 90-minute, a 30-minute, and because we pull social studies into reading, we now have another 60 minutes that can be used for a variety. So out of the bag, we have 180 minutes, which is what you need to offer a full tiered instruction. Don't tell me you have Tier 3 and the kids are getting 45 minutes a day more than what typical kids are getting. That's not even the full Monty for Tier 2. And there are many schools that don't have the capacity time-wise or people-wise to offer Tier 3. It's just not there. And you have to be realistic about that. You can't say, well, we're putting them through Tier 3 instruction, and so I think, maybe this kid has a disability or something. No, you didn't put him through. You gave him 45 minutes more than everybody else, and you expected that to catch the kid up. So remember, any kid is behind. To catch up, any group of kids, they have to immediately start moving a year for a year, plus a portion of what they're behind. So any kid academically who is behind has to grow at a faster rate than every kid in the building who has no learning issues. That's the burden we face. That's why time is your gift, but you have to find it. And if your school is saying, well, we're an environment where all students can and will learn, I see that so many places. Sure, but how fast will they learn? They're all learning and they're 3 years behind, but they're continuing to learn, right? So that implies some kind of standards. So time is huge. So there's lots of ways to make the instruction more effective, and one of those is what we're going to talk about today in this session. Leadership accounts for 28 to 29% of the variance that predicts student outcomes. And the Wallace report cites all of the research. A guy named, for those of you who've been in ed leadership classes, you probably have read about Leithwood and others back about in the, I guess, 90s. Leithwood said 25% attributed to leadership. But given the statistics and the statistical methods back then, the Wallace Foundation thought that wasn't the case. They thought it was less. Turns out, in this report, they come right out and say, we were wrong. It's actually higher than Leithwood said. So we talked about in one of the sessions what leadership has to look like for you to grab that 28%, right? Teaming and collaboration, we're going to, a couple of themes before we get into the specific teaming and collaboration. Across a number of school activities, when teams do something, the impact on student growth is greater than when individuals do that. So I've already said for collaboration, if there is a school-wide climate and structure for collaboration, you will see increase in student outcomes. If individuals are collaborating, it's not going to be significant. When this new research that just came out, I don't know, a month ago, that when problem solving is done by teams, the effect on student outcomes is significant. When it's done by individuals, much less so. So there's this idea, and I'll go back to one of if you weren't here for the leadership. There's only one leadership model, collective or cooperative, that is evidence-based to get you the bump in student outcomes. Only one. And once again, collective or collaborative is principals and teachers working as teams to address issues. So this idea that if you have a team environment, regardless of what you're doing, student outcomes will be much better than if they're not. So let me ask you, why do you think, what is it about teams that most likely accounts for the increase in student outcomes? Yeah. Speak up a little bit.
Buy-in.
Buy-in? Yes. And do you want to say why? How does buy-in occur in a team?
By feeling as though you're part of creating a solution, you're not being given a solution.
Absolutely. So it is that you will be invested in something you create, as opposed to something someone tells you to do. And even if you're happy to be told that, there still isn't the engagement, the energy, the monitoring, the commitment, whatever word you want. You're right, if you were involved in it. If we take a look at some of the strategies, like I mentioned last hour, Kathleen Lane's work at the University of Kansas, where behavioral strategies integrated into instruction to improve student engagement. Something as simple as student choice. You don't say, do this, do this, do this. Say, you can do this one of 3 or 4 ways. You make the decision how you're going to do it. Here are the ways you can do it. Instantly now the student made the choice. I'm doing this. I'm my own boss now. So there's a lot of nuances here that these team things, so that's buy-in is certainly one of them, and a huge one. What else can you think of? Yes?
I think you're all moving in the same direction. So you have a common goal, and everyone's moving in the same direction. Different ways of going about it, but we've decided on this goal.
Yes.
And we're all gonna take our part.
So consistency, but also, and when we get to one of the areas here in a few minutes, I'll give a better example. But the multi-tiered system is wonderful. It's for all the reasons we've talked about. And we all need a framework to how to integrate all this stuff. But the reality is that that multi-tiered system can fractionalize efforts, particularly if there's more than one person involved. And if those individuals all working with Karen are doing their due diligence, but Karen is not getting an integrated, practicing the same stuff, etc., then it's going to fall by the wayside. Because the academic engaged time she's getting, she's left to integrate this. And we see this with behavior supports. Somebody asked me, last hour, what are typical tier 2 behavior supports? So in the building where I was a building principal for a number of years, our tier 2 was very simple. It was things like social skills training, anger control training, empathy training. It's replacement skills that students can have new behaviors to respond to old situations without it being bad behavior, okay? But we used Arnold Goldstein's skill streaming. Every teacher used the same language for academics and behavior. So if Karen was having a problem and the teacher knew what we were doing in tier 2, I would say, Karen, please stop and think. You can make a good choice or not a good choice. Do you know what your choices are? And if she says, no, I'm going to tell them to her. You can do this, 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 or this. And no choice is not a good choice. And now let's suppose that Karen doesn't want to do that because she doesn't want to be compliant to ruin her badass reputation with the rest of the peer group. So then the teacher says, do you want Karen to make a good choice or a bad choice? And all the kids know, they'll say, good choice. So now she's free. So every teacher knew how to move the students through the steps that were used to teach the skills. So now it's exactly like whoever was doing social skills, they're hearing it just as a different face. That, and if everybody planned, that's what you get, as opposed to pulling kids out to do tier 2 with a behavior specialist, a school psychologist, a counselor, social, wherever, and you're just pounding it. And the kid goes back, and that transfer of training has no common antecedents. It doesn't have any of the common language that will trigger those responses that we're working very hard to get muscle memory around, the muscle being the brain, right? So does that make sense? Sure. So it is being sure kids are getting an integrated whatever, and that people are buying into and taking responsibility for the whatever. So if you can do it some other way, that's great. But I don't know how to do it. Integrating instruction across the tiers is hard. There's no question. We'll talk a little bit about it. Integrating behavior stuff is hard. We have all these wonderful behavioral strategies that by themselves show evidence. But we hold the kid accountable for figuring out how to take what my check in, check out person did, or my social, and as I walk into that classroom, they're not with me. I'm on my own. I got to remember how that was like this. And so everybody's working hard, everybody's doing a great job, but the kid's not improving. So that's what the purpose of this teaming and collaboration. Any comments about that or questions? Oh, I'm staying over here. It'll take me a few times with the social skills training to get it right. And if you keep prompting me, she's going like this. Karen was a bit more blatant. She's like, go over there. All right. So, just quickly, I'm going to give you 2 minutes with generically this lump of how there are data for each of the components, and each of the components other than instruction contributes differential amount to student outcomes, okay? I'll give you 3 minutes, and I'd like you to talk to somebody behind you, in front of you, I don't care. To what degree is your learning community aware that every one of these components is important? Because if you don't do it the right way, you lose its impact on student growth. How do you think if these data were known, how do you think, what changes do you think or improvement would come out in your MTSS framework? So 3 minutes starting right now. I'll give you a 30-second warning. Go. All right. So we're going to focus on this communication and collaboration. So the influence of parents and students is significantly related to student achievement. The reason we're not going to talk about that is because it's not as specifically defined in strategies. So the greater level of parent involvement and support in schools, and the same for students, we're looking to create a climate in which that effective instruction can have a bigger impact. Student achievement is higher in schools where teachers share leadership and when they perceive greater involvement by parents. And that is perceive and involvement. Does that mean coming to a meeting? Does it mean baking goods? Does it mean volunteering? It's the teacher's perception of the involvement that's related to the outcomes. So in the first session today, where we talked about leadership and collective leadership, the Wallace Foundation, in doing this research, interviewed tons of teachers and principals. And the principals who used a more of authoritarian style, top-down, when asked why you chose that leadership model, the most common answer, not the only one, but the most common answer was that teachers won't respect me if I don't have this approach. When they interviewed the teachers said they respected principals far more when they had collective leadership skills. So both sides thought the other was, or at least that is what you would imply. I don't know how many meetings I've been at over my career in talking about students who are struggling, whether it's academic or behavior. And it doesn't happen every time, but it happens frequently enough to become predictable, where people say, you know, the parents are not involved in all. Until they're involved, there's basically nothing we can do. How many of you have heard that before? It's common. When in reality, if you go back here, to this, just with instruction and leadership, you've got 61%, hold 61% of the variance that predicts student outcomes. So the issue is, you can't control a lot of things about kids' lives, but you should be doing what you can control well. And that will lead us into taking a look at. So how much does collaboration improve student outcomes? Schools with higher levels of collaboration also had a higher level of student achievement, even after controlling for. And you can read all of that. It's like every excuse about why it doesn't. It worked even after controlling for all of those issues. So why would you not do it? A direct effect exists between teacher collaboration and student achievement. An indirect effect occurs as a result of the principal's instructional leadership because they mediate and create the conditions for good collaboration. One of the things that we talked about in the first session was that the role of a principal should be providing direction and exercising influence. One of the things they shouldn't be doing universally is getting in the way of teaching strategies. Because some principals are not instructional leaders. I've worked with many who are not. The teachers have far more understanding of instruction and curriculum. So the principal's role is creating a climate in which all of these other things can happen. We also showed some data on what happens to a school when a highly effective principal, whatever she or he did, is moved to another school. The vast majority of the time, the school that that person left does what? Yeah, if you want to look at the research, very database research on that, you can do principal turnover, Harvard Ed. And they got it down to saying, when a new principal came in who didn't keep the effective practices going and the climate, that rate of student growth leveled for up to 18 months. Now think about education. We are a profession or an environment of fads. We go from one thing to another, right? The only problem in education, we don't drop what we were doing before, we just keep adding more stuff. So this whole issue of the climate is critical. Teacher teaming did not influence student achievement on average. They looked at all sorts of kind of team activities. However, when it focuses on a few things, it does impact student outcomes. So preparing together for instruction, co-teaching, observing one another, and grouping students flexibly for particular instructional purposes had better student achievements. So instructional planning. There's a science to lesson planning and instructional planning. And how many of you work in schools or work with schools where basically the teachers just lesson plan? There's no protocols. How many of you have in your district a protocol for lesson planning? One, two, a few do. They just leave it up to teachers. Planning, so there's a couple of football coaches that got fired this last weekend. And I love sports, and so I'm kind of a sports person with analogies. You can't fix a football game on Friday night in the middle of the game that you planned badly for. So the first semester of the fall that I was a building principal, I did basically a sit, listen, learn, observe, just trying to figure out what's going on here. And so I observed, not evaluation. I sat in classrooms. I was hardly ever in my office. I was in classrooms, just, can you imagine sitting in your office? This is boring. So I saw some amazing instruction. And I saw some stuff that I didn't know what to call it. It certainly was not instruction. And I'm like, what's going on here? So I did that for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And then I finally had an epiphany. I wonder if the people who are delivering really good instruction have a different planning process than the people who don't. So I started sitting in on planning meetings because we had instructional planning time. And it ranged from a group of grade level teachers who were just at it, and others that you would think it was a break. So you all know what you're going to do this week, blah, 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 blah. Basically, no planning whatsoever, just continuing to do what they did. So, and this was before some of this research came out. So the question becomes, how do you plan for instruction? So I'm just going to give a couple of examples, and I'm going to ask you to talk about something amongst yourselves. There is a science to doing this, and there are protocols. My email is on the front of this PowerPoint. If you want me to send you some of that stuff, I'll be happy to. And some of you in here know me. If you email me, I will respond to you. It may take 3 or 4 days, but I will respond. Just say what you want. So imagine this. You're planning for a lesson, and you're talking about the different things you can use and how to keep the kids engaged and all of this kind of stuff. So we do this when we train teachers to do this lesson planning. And they come up with a plan for a particular learning goal or what have you. We actually let them pick the learning goal and do the strategies. And then I ask them to take out paper and a pencil or a writing instrument. No computers allowed, because what I ask them to do next, what makes it difficult. I ask them to close their eyes until they can see themselves delivering this lesson to their students. And with their non-dominant hand, raise their hand when they see themselves doing this in their classroom. And then with their writing hand, I ask them to write the first name of the students who are not engaged. And they do it every time. Then how many? It averages in a class of 20 to 25 kids, it averages 5 to 6 kids that teachers put down on the list. And then I said, so you knew that these students were not going to be able to engage this lesson. Why did you wait until something happened? Why didn't you think about that? I don't say it quite that harshly, but why didn't you say, now, who is this lesson not going to work for? And plan for that. Why wait till the kid goes off? Kids take anywhere from 1 minute to 3 minutes when a lesson is introduced to decide if they can do it, want to do it, can do, won't do, whatever the situation is. Quickly, they make the decision. So why wouldn't we have a planning process where we do that? This is how we integrate. I'm not going to get into this, but in the process, this is where we integrate UDL, the 3 principles of UDL. Multiple ways of presenting material, multiple ways of allowing students to respond on what they know, and then the degree to which these strategies are engaging the student to engage. We don't have separate UDL stuff. It's integrated into the lesson planning process. At that point where we are constructing instruction, deciding what choices the students are going to have on how they can demonstrate stuff, what if you, I won't even go into it. You get the point, okay? So all of that has to be considered, as opposed to, I live in Tampa. We have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. And the thing, I got up early this morning and electronically I was reading the newspaper. And so we started out really well, and now we've been losing. And somebody did an analysis saying that the defensive coordinators of the teams we're playing have now figured out Baker Mayfield. They hadn't planned for what he did before. Now they're planning, and we're scoring no points, basically. I mean, a few. So why wouldn't we plan before we deliver instruction when we know who is going to engage it and who isn't? So that's the real issue here. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to ask you to talk about what your lesson planning is. How would you go about improving this lesson planning process so that you increased student growth using some kind of effective integrated lesson planning? That's collaboration 1, teaming 1 around lesson planning. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes, go. I'm going to also ask you to share some ideas. I'm sorry I keep walking in front of them. Okay, if you could start wrapping up your conversation, please. If a few people would raise their hand and just summarize your discussion, if it was on topic. If it was not on topic, I don't need for you to summarize your discussion. Thank you.
We had, oops, sorry, this is really
No.
loud. We had just said how difficult, with the amount of new teachers we have right now, it's difficult to implement UDL well with them. But we have found that common planning time is essential, having those expectations around what that looks like, and mixing up the ability or age level of the teachers, so that if I'm partnered with a strong veteran teacher who's able to do this well, I'm going to learn a lot faster how to do this rather than doing this in a silo in isolation.
Yes, and I was asked a question 2 sessions ago about how people in a collective leadership model can feel like leaders. And I said, in that collective leadership model, there is the principals, her or his way of creating that environment, bringing that model to the school. But distributed leadership is also part of that. Not sharing with the teachers, but sharing leadership with teachers and other people. And what you said just now makes perfect sense, because there's no way with all the new teachers out there that any one person or 2 people or 3 people could be responsible for this leadership. It has to be distributed. We're going to talk after lunch in that session about cross-training. And distributing leadership is an example of cross-training, so that you do take strong teachers, whatever they are, and you simply sit down with everybody and say, we have 14 new teachers. How can we as a group mentor them to be where we want, so they will become the teachers we know they can be as a team, as a school? And then simply go through what it is they need to have. Let's say it's integrated lesson planning as one of them. Let's say UDL is another one. So I love what you said. And I'm going to not push back on you, but I'm going to push back again. This idea that you have separate UDL training, there are 3 principles of UDL. They're very specific. So we train teachers on UDL, and then they go back and they're like, well, how do I fit this in? It's very simple. When you're doing lesson planning, multiple ways of presenting instruction, multiple ways, how we're going to let the kids give us their best way of performing. It's so common sense you don't have to think about it anymore. And then there's, of course, the technology things and what have you that are very important. So I love that. It fits right across the leadership model. It fits right across I much prefer embedded professional learning. I mentioned previously, I work with a school district in California that they're doing, it's a small school district in the middle of the desert. You fly to Phoenix and drive for 2 hours until there's no more water available anywhere, and that's when you are at this place. But instead of doing training, we are taking actual meetings with the new protocol and guiding them through that process. And after 4 or 5 of these, they've got it. And there was no send them someplace, worry about transfer of training. So I love what you're saying, which is job embedded stuff. You have all these tests to do anyway. Why not have some guidance to get consistency on how to do it well? Perfect. Yes. You have a question in the, no, other questions? All right. Oh, yes. Thank you. I knew if I wait long enough, somebody could get nervous enough to raise their hand.
No, it's just, it takes a lot of time to sometimes collect your thoughts. But one of the things that we were talking about is with the pandemic and trying to develop everything online, it makes us kind of double back now and question, well, are we too rigid because we made all these plans that have now been scripted and
Right.
the student population is changing all the time. So thinking about planning to make that adaptable.
Yes. So the question is, was it appearing up here? Okay, it was. Okay, fine. So the question is how to make it adaptable. I'll just give you the logistics of how we do it. We do lesson planning as a team once a month. and we have 4 weeks. Everybody's lessons plans go on Google Docs so that the reading teacher, special ed, whoever, they can access it. If there are going to be any changes in that the teachers do, as soon as you modify the Google Doc, it sends an alert to everybody saying that this has been changed. It's really, I'll give you another reason why it's important, but it should be flexible. And the other issue is that we continue to have a high mobility rate. Depending upon where you live, maybe Pennsylvania is a little bit less so, but the average mobility rate in elementary school for students is 39%, coming and going. So as 39%, as the tenure of superintendents, by the way, number of years is now only 2.2 years, average. That doesn't mean it's in your place or what have you. So the students are changing. The other issue is if you're really using progress monitoring data, you may find that you have to teach something longer or teach it again, and it's going to delay your pacing chart. High school teachers are pretty good, particularly math teachers. They build in their pacing chart the difficulty level of the units and provide more time for more difficult units and less time for less difficult units. So it should be adaptable, absolutely. So you triggered something there. I want to give you one example. I'll make it maybe the most difficult example. You have a group of students, and it's an actual situation. It's a case study I also use in doing lesson planning facilitation. You have in this one classroom, I think it's a 6th grade classroom, 5th grade, 6th grade, you have 5 kids who are significantly below level in reading. 3 of them are kids with identified specific learning disabilities in the area of reading, and 2 of them are not identified as kids with disabilities, but their performance level is at the same level with these 5 kids. The kids with learning disabilities are getting services from SLD personnel and reading personnel. The kids without the disabilities are getting instruction from reading person and SLD person. And you can do that. And you can claim all your stuff based upon how you organize the student groups, okay? So now we have a situation, how is the reading person, the SLD person, and the classroom teacher going to team to ensure continuity of instruction? So one of the things we know if you have off-level kids, 6th grade reading at the 2nd grade level, that we always want to use for transfer of training, we always want to use the classroom materials for the grade in which the kid is enrolled. So whether that's social studies book, it's a reading, whatever they're doing. That's what the reading teacher, that's what the SLD teacher does. And they can pull words from that, where they can be practicing fluency, vocabulary. I mentioned earlier today that you never do fluency without also doing vocabulary check. As you're teaching kids to sound out CVCC words or whatever, you say, well, now that you can read it, what is it? What does it mean? Any of you had the honor and privilege of participating in something with Anita Archer? She's been a huge influence. We call her the Mother Earth of literacy instruction. And myself and a number of people worked for 5 years in Wichita, Kansas, with the Wichita School District. And when she was participating, where we're doing all of this kind of stuff around teaming and lesson planning and what have you, oh, sorry, thank you. Just stick, I need to. Now, she talked about just-in-case instruction and just-in-time instruction. Just-in-case instruction would maybe be working on vocabulary through vocabulary building programs. And she's like, what's the probability that those words you're working on are actually in the materials that these kids are reading? So why wouldn't you work on vocabulary, pre-teaching kinds of stuff, just in time so the kids would know the meaning of the words they're going to be reading tomorrow? And why would you have bogus words that you're teaching fluency with and what have you, just in case the kids ever came across that word, when you could be pulling the words out of the materials that the general education teacher uses as the basis for your specialized instruction? So these are the conversations we have in these teaming meetings. Now imagine this. As a result of that meeting, the SLD people know exactly what they're going to be doing with the classroom materials tied to the pacing chart for the lesson plans, which are on Google Docs. The reading teacher is doing the same thing, and the whole goal of these supports is to pre-teach kids so that when they go to the classroom, go to Karen's classroom tomorrow, that is a second exposure to the material, which is a way of ensuring that the time we used with these people translates into more academic engaged time with the student in the real classroom. And those kinds of things, the brainstorming, that's what happens in the meeting. And what does the kid get? The kid gets instruction that's meaningful, tied to classroom instruction, and allows the kid, when we go so far, for particularly kids with fluency issues, they will rehearse 3 or 4 times if teachers are using oral recitation, 3 or 4 sentences to be able to read fluently when it's their turn, as opposed to the teacher skipping over them because you only read at the 2nd grade level. This is 6th grade material. And the kid knows what it is, and the teacher knows what it is. I'm like, Karen, could you read the next 2 sentences, please? And she reads them fluency, and all the peers drop off the chair like, how did she do that? That's what lesson planning is about. It's not just about picking an instruction and writing it down and saying, I'm going to do this. But you can't have these deep, meaningful conversations and bring teachers' expertise and ideas. It's a treasure trove when you sit in one of these meetings listening to them. How are we going to do it? And they've got ideas nonstop. That's why this works. So I really like where you started. You triggered all that. Any other comments or thoughts? Let me ask you this. What are barriers you'd have to overcome to have meetings once a month with all instructional personnel? So that would be grade level teachers, I'd just say title in the case of reading, special ed there. Also, you would have behavior specialists. You would have, because tied to this is, I don't know how to manage these 3 kids. Well, that's how I mentioned Kathleen Lane's 7 behavior supports integrated into instruction, all of which are evidence-based to improve kids' engagement. So you bring the behavior supports into it. And a behavior specialist might say, let's take a look at opportunity to respond. Be sure, let's use instructional choice. How would we do that? Okay? Non-compliant kids using high probability behaviors to foster low probability behaviors. I used to do that all the time. Ask kids, Karen, could you go over and grab a pencil off my desk? I need to show you something here. Yes. So you go and do that. She's not going to kick back on that. And they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, I needed a blue one. There's one of those up there too. So you get a kid in a compliant momentum. You know what I'm talking. And then you nail them with the thing that they didn't want to do, and they're in that momentum, and the probability that they will comply, or you can have a knockdown, drag out, non-compliant moment. I'm standing here until you do this. If you don't do that, you may go right to the principal's office. And the students, finally, you figured this out, didn't you? So all of that comes into the planning. Because the teachers say, what is it about those 5 kids? What do I have to do? And it's just awesome. It's just incredible. Okay, any other comments or thoughts? So what about a barrier? What would be some things you'd have to overcome in order to implement something like this? Once a month, yes?
We do have planning time together. The biggest barrier we have is when that time is together, there are philosophical differences in what the role of a teacher is. For example, you could have two social studies teachers. One feels it's their job to support the ELA department, reading and writing skills. The other says they are not a reading and writing teacher, and that is not what they're there for. They're there to teach history. So that is the biggest barrier, and sometimes those barriers are fought for 20 years.
Yes. And so that's a very good point, and that's where the role of building leadership comes in. You have those courageous conversations nobody wants to have, as opposed to trying some top-down, or most often it's simply ignored because nobody wants to have the courageous conversations. And they can be had even with the most stick-in-the-mud kind of people. And a lot of that is building collegial support for doing it. Not going to go mano a mano. You're going to build that support in their team for doing it. Other thoughts? Barriers? Yes.
So ours is that sometimes teachers think that the planning time that they have is determined by what they want to do and not, and not what, no, you need to have planning time
Yep.
together. Am I making that?
You are. So what we're looking here is at making a shift from what they want to do to a process that is hugely beneficial for students. So I don't see that any differently than if we're going to be looking at a different reading curriculum. You honor what people bring, and you try to take that and move it more toward this goal for building, not telling, right. It's always been my experience that resistance, at least a building principal, district administrator, had nothing to do with clash of beliefs. It had to do with a fear of loss. What am I going to lose if I do this? Am I going to lose respect? Is it learning something new too much of a risk? Is it that I'm going to lose time because I want to use the same lesson plans that I've used for the last 5 years? And now I'm going to lose that. So as a leader, when I would get that, I would always just stop and think, let's come back to that and have another conversation. I think, what is the fear here? And it is a nice way to look at it. Okay. All right. Let's look at the second one. So the second one is analyzing student data and developing instructional responses. The only two evidence-based activities one collaborates on that are known to improve student outcomes are these two. So I'll talk about this a little bit more, and then I'm going to ask you to do some talking. But if you know that the precious time for collaboration, that there's only two focus areas that are evidence-based to improve student outcomes, why are we spending the precious time to collaborate about other things? If you needed a health issue and there are two approaches to treatment that work, why would you not use one of them? So you now know it. Anything else you collaborate around may serve a purpose. It may have a great purpose, but it is not evidence-based to contribute to student growth, increasing the rate of student growth. Not saying you shouldn't do it, but just know if you're doing it. Don't do it with the expectation that kids are going to get better because of it. Not yet, anyway. So, the data-based thing, the words here are carefully chosen, and developing instructional responses. The last session we did was taking a look at organizing data, all data, into risk levels. Having decision rules for determining if growth is just improvement or if it's actually bringing students closer to the academic and behavioral goals. And then guidelines for based upon positive, questionable, or poor rate of growth, there were established instructional decisions to be made. So for positive, it was continue it, it's working, the kid's lowering risk levels, or the kids are lowering risk levels. Get them to goal, continue it to strengthen them even further, and then fade whatever supports you've been providing in order to get that improvement. And increase progress monitoring in case the kids start to slip. Those are the 4 steps. Every team does that for a positive response to some type of instruction. They don't pick and choose. They pick the instruction. They pick the fading. There's all sorts of stuff for them to make those professional decisions around. If it's a questionable response, questionable means you have improved, but not enough to lower a risk level. You're getting better, but you're not closing the gap. It means whatever you're doing is working, just not enough. So after you check for fidelity to be sure it was all done the way it's supposed to be done, you intensified that, whatever that is that you're doing. More time, narrow the focus more. There's 3 ways to intensify, right? Time, focus, and type of instruction in an MTSS model. And then see what happens. If there is no more rate of improvement, then we go back to problem solving. Because we already know the kid's not going to be hitting any benchmarks with this. We've done everything we can with it. And we need to rethink this. If the kid is going opposite direction, has a poor response, and everything was done with integrity, we absolutely stop it and go back to problem solving and say, we missed the mark. It's not working. But because time is the best predictor of student growth, we cannot keep doing something that's not working. We have to know if it's working or not. If it's working some, we're going to intensify it. If it's not working at all and we've done everything we can, we're going to go back and say, we got to find something else. But do it systematically through problem solving. So this analyzing student data and developing instructional responses is what problem solving is all about. As I spoke last session, the research on problem solving, the recent research on it, or at least recent published research on it, published recently, is that problem solving done by teams is more effective than problem solving done by individuals by a long shot. So once again, why would the team doing the problem solving be more effective than an individual teacher, psychologist, counselor doing the problem solving? What is it about the team again? How about multiple perspectives, multiple ideas? If everybody's involved in the problem-solving process and they come up with the instructional decisions, you don't have to then go around and get everybody else involved. They developed it. So they hit the ground running, and everybody's on the same page because everybody solved the problem together. So the theme here, obviously, is that collaboration and teaming cuts down on the ineffective inconsistencies across people when doing stuff. And the ownership issue is really important. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to talk for about 3 minutes. How do you, oh, and so also, those are actual quotes out of the document, Ronfeld stuff. So analyzing student data, what they're saying here is only use data for the purpose of developing intensified or modifying instruction. Don't talk about it. The last hour, we don't need to know standard scores. We don't need to know reading fluency rates. We just need to know, is the student improving? Are they improving to lower a risk? What is the decision, positive, questionable, or poor? and you have instructional ramifications of each one of those. That's it. But the idea that we sit around and we talk about data, next time you go to a data meeting, if that meeting does not end with some energy put into what are we going to do about it tomorrow, you have just wasted a meeting, because it's the data and the instructional decision making. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to talk about how are you doing analyzing student data and developing instructional responses as a team. What are you already doing that you could build on? What are some barriers that you're facing to move it to a more collaborative level? 3 minutes, go. I want to add, we have 1 minute and I think a lot of people left. So I just want to add one more strategy around time. And the person here who just asked me for Kathleen Lane's, the info on that book. So in basically all the schools and districts I work with, they get her book. I know of her, I've never met her. It's not like I'm getting a cut from anybody. So in every building that we've implemented it in, there are 6 or 7 strategies. We take one strategy a month. We have a 30-minute meeting on the essence of that strategy, how to do it. We then turn it over to subject area or grade level teams. And we come back 3.5 weeks later and say, oh yeah, we could meet if we needed to, but typically 3.5 weeks later and say, how is this working? What did you find it best useful for? Do you have any questions? Blah, blah, blah. And then the next month we have another one. In 6 months, we have an entire school trained on how to integrate behavior supports into the delivery of instruction, and we use no time. Completely job embedded. So that kind of stuff is how you get more done with less time. Job embedded, if you can. So before you leave, 2 things, you already know what this is going to be. First, think about, or write down, whichever you want to do, one thing that you're going to follow up on as a result of being in this session. Or if it's nothing, just write down nothing. Should have gone to something else. Because once I leave a session, I forget what it was I thought about. And I want to put something down to follow up. You define follow up, okay? And second, thank you for coming. Have a great rest of your conference.